Buongiorno. I'm Dr. Ruggiero. Join me in rebuilding the Renaissance and making art and history come to life. 600 years later, the dome still standing there, serving as testimony to the greatness of Florence. Buongiorno, everyone, and welcome to Milan. It's usually celebrated as the first work of the High Renaissance. The sculpture would surpass any of the ancient statues then known in Rome.
History comes to life in the online video series Italian Masterpieces, hosted by Ruggiero. From the creative genius of the artists and architects who made them, to the wealthy and influential patrons who commissioned them, Italian Masterpieces looks at the art in its own historical context, but will also explore how it is experienced in our own time. Watch Italian Masterpieces, now available online and on DVD at rockyRuggiero.com.
Buongiorno, everyone. We're here in Piazza Santa Maria Novella in Florence. That church behind me is the Basilica of Santa Maria Novella, which was built beginning in the year 1279. And the church is the seat of the Dominican order here in Florence, right? Or the followers of Saint Dominic, an order that was established at the beginning of the 13th century with one specific mission, which was to fight against heresy. In fact, one of the things you notice when you enter into Dominican churches is that a majority of the art that you find is didactic and instructional art, sort of meant to reinforce the teachings and beliefs of the church. And so holds true for Masaccio's great masterpiece inside, which is his Holy Trinity. Buongiorno, everyone, and welcome to Milan, or as the Italians call it, Milano. This is the second largest city in Italy after Rome, with a greater urban population of about 3 million people. Milan's probably best known as the industrial, financial, and fashion capital of Italy, but it also houses some of the greatest artworks of the Renaissance. In fact, Milan's Gothic cathedral, the Duomo as it's called, is one of the few churches in Italy that could stand up against the great Northern European cathedrals such as Notre Dame or Chartres. There's a gallery here, the Pinacoteca Brera as it's called, which is actually my second favorite museum in Italy after the Borghese Gallery in Rome. And we're standing here at a church called Santa Maria delle Grazie, which houses the most wonderful of all the masterpieces, and that is, of course, Leonardo da Vinci's Last Supper. I'm standing here in the courtyard of the Uffizi Gallery. As you can tell by the crowds around me, this is a very popular museum. Right? The Uffizi is one of the top 5 museums on the planet, along with the Louvre, the Vatican Museums, the National Gallery in London, and the Metropolitan Museum of New York City. Now consider that when this museum is running at full capacity, they're letting in upwards of 8,000 to 10,000 people a day. And when it is running at full capacity, I have 3 nicknames for the Uffizi Gallery. The first of which is Vietnam. Then I started calling it Black Friday. And my latest nickname is the Dementor of Museums. Right? If you're fans of the Harry Potter series, you may remember the Dementors, who sucked the life and spirit out of their victims. So too oftentimes do the crowds here at the Uffizi Gallery. But don't let the crowds ruin your experience here. The Uffizi contains the world's most important collection of medieval and Renaissance Italian paintings, and one of those masterpieces is Botticelli's sensational Birth of Venus painting. The church that you see behind me is the Basilica of St. Peter's, or technically the new Basilica of St. Peter's, not to be confused with the old Basilica. The old Basilica was consecrated in the year 326 AD under the reign of a Roman emperor named Constantine to mark the burial place of St. Peter, the first pope and the vicar of Christ. And that old church lasted all the way up to the beginning of the 16th century when it was demolished under the reign of a pope named Julius II. And it was Julius who in 1606 asked the great Renaissance architect Bramante to knock down the old church and begin the construction of the new one. Now, this new church would take 120 years to complete and would involve the reign of 18 different popes and 12 different architects, eventually becoming the global capital of the religion that we call Catholicism today. And to my left-hand side, you can see those structures in the distance. That is the Apostolic Palace. That technically is the residence of the popes today. And just beyond are the Vatican Museums and the Sistine Chapel as well. Buongiorno, everyone, and welcome to Florence, Italy. There's no better place to introduce this city than up here at the Piazza Michelangelo. And I'm using this viewpoint to illustrate the skyline of Florence the way you see it today. And that church that's closest to us here is the Basilica of Santa Croce, which is technically the world's largest Franciscan church. And construction on that building started in the year 1294. Across town, you see that massive marble-clad church with the big red dome on it. That is the Cathedral of Florence, which is technically the world's third largest Christian church. And construction there started in the year 1296. Across town again, that big brownstone tower that you see is a building known as Palazzo Vecchio. It was built as town hall beginning in the year 1299, and it still serves as town hall today, right? Not bad for continuity there, right? About 7 centuries or so. And then that pointy tower just beyond sits on the major Dominican church of Florence, which is called Santa Maria Novella. If any of you have ever taken a train to this city, you may remember getting off at a train station with the same name because it's located right behind the church, okay? And that church went up in the year 1279. Now, the reason I'm throwing all these dates at you right off the bat is that you may have picked up a pattern here, and that is that almost the entire skyline of the city dates back to the year 1300. And this is a very important point to begin with, because most people who come to Florence come here looking for something called the Renaissance, right? That rebirth of all things Greek and Roman. But consider that the Renaissance does not begin until the year 1400. So technically speaking, Florence is not a Renaissance city. It is a medieval city where the Renaissance began. In the year 1418, the Opera, or the Works Committee of the cathedral, essentially announced a competition, a bando as we call it in Italian, essentially asking anyone who had any idea at all how to build the dome, or who had any knowledge or experience in dome construction, or who could assist in the development of the machinery and the technology that would make the dome possible, to please come forward with an idea or a proposal. And the winner of the competition would receive a pretty handsome cash prize of 200 gold florins, which was a pretty substantial amount of money at the time. Now, one of the major issues that they were facing is the fact that every dome or arch or vault, built up to this point in history, we're in the early 1400s, had been constructed the same way, and that was using a method called centering. All right, you build the structure in wood first, you put your masonry on top of it, you wait for your cement or mortar to dry, and then one makes the sign of the cross, pulls the wooden framework away, and gets the hell out of there as quickly as they can, because 1 out of 2 times these structures came crumbling to the ground. Okay, this was an inexact science at the time. So remember, when you come to Florence, it's not just the Uffizi and the Accademia. It's the whole city that serves as an open-air museum. And when you're walking down these narrow streets and these back alleys, remind yourselves, you're walking down the same streets and alleys that guys like Dante and Brunelleschi and Leonardo and Michelangelo walked as many as 700 years ago. And there's no other city in the world that can brag to that kind of experience.
Dr. Rocky Ruggiero examines the rise to power and legacy of one of the longest-lasting dynasties in history in Medici, The Art of Power. The Medici family became one of the most wealthy and powerful in Renaissance Italy. Not only were they bankers to some of Europe's most important rulers, but also great patrons of the arts. This documentary explores how the art of the Renaissance had become the visual geopolitical language of the Medici, a language of power. Medici, the Art of Power. Watch October 17th at 9 p.m. on Rhode Island PBS.
On September 7th of 1433, Cosimo de' Medici was summoned before the Signoria. But instead of being brought before the city council, he was ushered up the 233 stairs and nearly 90 meters of tower and brought into the prison cell reserved for political prisoners. Cosimo was brought into the prison cell known as the Albert Ghetto, or Little Hotel Room in English, right? The irony, of course, being the five-star luxury that its guests received. And tradition in Florence was that if you came into the cell, you never made it to trial because you accidentally fell out the window first. Or you came down with a mysterious illness, which means that you were poisoned. We're told that Cosimo did not eat nor drink for several days while he was in this cell, for fear, in fact, that he would be poisoned. And he was essentially cut off from the outside world, with the exception of one man, and that was his jailer, who fortunately for Cosimo was sympathetic to his cause and communicated with the outside world for him, essentially informing all of Cosimo's supporters and enemies that Cosimo was willing to spend as much money as necessary to reduce his sentence from death, which is the usual punishment for treason, to exile. And essentially getting out of Florence with his life was Cosimo's priority. So we're here in the courtyard of the Medici Palace. And although this building is celebrated as being the first Renaissance-style domestic structure, there's very little that's Renaissance about it from the outside. That rusticated brownstone is typical of medieval buildings in the city of Florence. But when you come inside, it's a celebration of early Renaissance architecture. Okay? A square courtyard that is delineated by these pietra serena columns. This gray stone, or serene stone as it's called, was actually introduced into architecture by the great Filippo Brunelleschi. And it's perfect for architectural articulation because it cuts so precisely. In fact, Michelangelo using that same stone here for his columns, which are then in turn covered with Corinthian capitals, right? And so one of the innovations of Renaissance architecture was reintroducing the classical orders of columns. And here we have Michelangelo using that Corinthian order, and those capitals in turn surmounted by semicircular arches. And so too, going back to doing arches the way the Romans did, which was rounded in form, no longer pointed arches, which was the typical way to articulate Gothic architecture. Okay? Then above the arches, we have this horizontal band, or what we call an entablature. And that entablature accommodates those three circular stone frames, or roundels. Now, the central roundel houses one of the most recognizable symbols in the city of Florence, and that, of course, is the coat of arms of the Medici family. The shield with the balls that you see was the symbol of the family itself. And so regardless of the shape of the shield, regardless of the number of balls, which will vary between 5 and 8, seeing that symbol is like seeing the name Medici written on something. When Duchess Eleanor of Toledo purchased the Pitti Palace in 1542 for the total cost of 9,000 florins, it looked a lot different than it does today. In fact, you see that main door behind me. You have the window above it, and then the window again. That's the central axis of the building. And if you had 3 window bays to the left and 3 to the right, that was the original width of the 15th century Pitti Palace. Everything beyond that was added by the Medici to make this a proper home for the new royal family of Florence. Okay, so let's head on in and take a look at this extraordinary chapel. Welcome to one of the hidden treasures of Florence. This is the Chapel of the Magi inside of the Medici Palace. It was a private chapel in the home of the Medici, where a priest could come over daily from the nearby Medici Church of San Lorenzo and say Mass for a very intimate audience, right? There's only room for about 10 people or so in these wooden choir stalls that you see. And while the Medici were hearing Mass, they could bask in art that was meant to glorify them. They could recharge their ego batteries here through the use of porphyry just about everywhere inside of this chapel, through the use of Medici symbols and mottos all over the walls, and probably most of all through this beautiful fresco cycle that you see that was painted by the great Florentine artist Benozzo Gozzoli, depicting the adoration of the Magi. Brunelleschi did get the contract. Okay? In fact, he climbed up there in the year 1420 with about 160 workers, okay, 20 men per 8 side of the dome, and began construction and essentially completed that construction in about a decade and a half. Okay? Building on the dome was completed by the year 1436. Now consider that it took them 131 years to build the cathedral up to the height of those circular windows that you see below the dome. And from that point up, Brunelleschi completed in
What are those windows you're talking about? Where are they?
See the dome?
Uh-huh.
Underneath the big
Yeah.
circle. It's right
Okay.
there. Okay. Now that part that's covered in white and green, that's part of the pre-existing structure before Brunelleschi got involved. And Brunelleschi's intervention starts with the brownstone. Okay. The brownstone is part of the dome, and it's essentially the foundation that fixes the dome onto the drum, like the musical instrument. And the drum is essentially part of a structure that negotiates the dome onto the base proper. 131 years to build up to the circular windows, 16 years to build everything above that. Okay? The total number of fatalities over that 16-year period was 3. Okay? 2 of which were alcohol-related deaths. Okay? They fell to their death or what have you. But consider that it is a substantially lower workplace fatality rate than in most building sites in the United States of America in 2018. I lived in Florence for 20 years. I got married in Europe. My wife is actually French, but we lived in Italy. Both my children were born in Florence. The influence and the importance that Italy has in the longevity and the survival of one of the most famous paintings in the world, which is The Last Supper, now here in LA. It's very difficult to get reservations to actually see the painting. When I take my students to Milan, and I usually go in February, I'm usually booking it in November of the previous year. Leonardo was known as the artist who never knew when to take his hand off of the canvas, okay? Because for him, it was never finished, right? He saw nature as a living thing. SJB. Anyone?
St. John the Baptist.
St. John the Baptist. No relation to the BVM. Who is?
The BVM?
The BVM.
No relation?
Blessed.
Virgin
Oh, no, she's
Mary.
his aunt, actually. You're absolutely right.
Yeah.
Well, cousin, technically, right? Yes, the Blessed Virgin Mary. Okay. Not to be confused with the GTF.
God the Father.
God the Father, nor the GTS.
The Son.
And the third person of the Holy Trinity, GTHS.
Holy Spirit.
God and the Holy Spirit. Exactly. Who you see. Of course, we've avoided the term BJ now in my abbreviations for everything.
Yes.
Jesus. Because Brunelleschi would not share his plan with the building committee, they actually thought that he was slightly off his rocker, right? Because they just couldn't imagine that they could somehow build a structure that tall that would eventually curve at about 60 degrees horizontal without something substantial holding it in place. So they kind of dismissed Brunelleschi as a raving madman. And essentially 2 years go by from when they announced the competition to when the Opera realized that they had to make a decision. Right? I mean, 2 years they've been dilly-dallying here. And so they'll have to just pick a project and go with it. And so they invite 11 architects as finalists in the competition. And they were so desperate that they invited Brunelleschi as well, just to hear about. Perhaps he would reveal something more about this mysterious project that he had. And the story goes that all 11 of the architects meet in a building that's just around the corner from the cathedral, and that Brunelleschi walked in the room and looked at the other 10 guys and said, okay, I know how to figure this out once and for all. And he reaches into his pocket and he pulls out an egg, like scrambled eggs, right? Buongiorno, everyone. I'm standing here in the Piazza della Signoria, one of the most famous and beautiful piazzas in all the world. You may recognize that sculpture there behind me. Okay? That's actually a copy of Michelangelo's famous statue of David. Okay? Now, the original statue actually stood out here in front of the Palazzo Vecchio for exactly 369 years. It was placed out here in the year 1504, and it was finally moved into a museum called the Accademia Gallery in the year 1873. Right? The copy instead was put out at the beginning of the 20th century and sort of shows us what this piazza looked like before, obviously, the original was moved. I'm standing here in front of the Accademia Gallery, which is home to the world's most famous sculpture, Michelangelo's David. Now, the decision to bring the David indoors was made in the 1860s because the sculpture was beginning to show signs of serious erosion. And of course, what they were worried about is if enough erosion occurred, it could cause structural damage. So they decided to bring the David indoors. But the question is, where do you bring such a large statue? There wasn't a single museum in Florence large enough to accommodate the David, so they decided to build an entire museum for it, and they built that museum next to an already extant building. This structure next to me is the Academy of Fine Arts, which is still operating as an art school here in the city of Florence. And so they decided to build a gallery onto the Academy, which is where we get the name the Accademia Gallery today. As the last few stragglers leave the Vatican museums, exhausted but happy, having realized just how extensive a collection this really is and how large the Vatican is as well, some 10,000 rooms located within the walls of this palace. And part of the reason is the tradition that every pope who's resided here since the middle of the 15th century has added on to the architectural legacy, including Pope Julius II, who built his own apartments on top of those of the previous pope, Alexander VI or Rodrigo Borgia, and then hired the artist Raphael to come in and decorate the walls of those apartments. Let's go on in and have a look. When the Medici become monarchs, their whole philosophy of patronage changes. Right? In the 15th century, it was this constant staying off the radar and worrying about your neighbors asking who the hell you thought you were. But when you become legitimate royalty, okay, if you're not going over the top, then you're not doing your job. And that's exactly what the Medici dukes did here at the so-called Chapel of the Princes. What I like to call the Las Vegas of the Renaissance, right? Just about every square inch of floor and wall and ceiling surface covered in decoration. Porphyry ubiquitous throughout the entire space. In fact, porphyry presently extinct. You can no longer find this in the natural world, and the joke is the reason is because the Medici used it all up here to decorate this structure. Imagine the contrast as well between that austere interior of the Basilica of San Lorenzo versus this explosion of Baroque decoration here in the Chapel of the Princes, right? This is something that was intended on their part. And the organization is such that the sarcophagi are actually lifted up off the ground, right? So the idea is that even in death, the dukes rule over us. Look at the size of those sarcophagi as well. Okay, I hope none of you think that the Medici dukes were physically this large, right? Their egos may have been, but they were not. The idea of oversized meaning monumentality. The Medici coat of arms at the center of the sarcophagus, and then the crown positioned on top of the cushion that breaks the lid that you see as well. You notice that the niches behind me are empty, because the plan was to fill them with effigies of the dukes, but of the 6 niches in this room, only 2 actually received their statues. The inscription above, indicating to whom each of the tomb is dedicated. And so what you have there is Cosmus, or Cosimo, capital letter I for the first. M is an abbreviation for Magna, or grand. Then DVX, or DUX, right? When you're reading these inscriptions, dukes, which is Latin for duke, and then ETR, the abbreviation for Etruria. Cosimo I, Grand Duke of Etruria. Etruria was the ancient name of the region that today we call Tuscany. And why are the dukes alluding to the Etruscans? Well, back in Etruscan times, they had kings. And so what these Medici dukes are doing is appropriating the legacy of the Etruscan kings, saying, look, once we had kings, now we are kings once again. The subject of the statue is David. And how do we know that it's David? Well, the rule of thumb in Florence is that if you walk up to a sculpture or a painting showing a young man standing over an oversized, disembodied head with a rock buried between its eyes, there's about a 9.5 chance in 10 that you're looking at a David image. Right? Now, this particular David was actually carved by Donatello in 2 different campaigns. The first time he was carving for the building committee, or the Opera of Florence Cathedral, and the year was 1408. Okay? But then 7 years later, Donatello was contracted by the Signoria, or the City Council of Florence, to work on it again. Right? And the reason is very simply this. When the Opera had originally commissioned this to Donatello, the originally intended location for the sculpture was on one of the back buttresses of Florence Cathedral, or in layman's terms, about 85 feet up in the air. And for that reason, the Opera specifically asked Donatello to make this statue alba, A-L-B-A, and magna, M-A-G-N-A. White, alba is the Latin word for white, magna, great, or large in scale. And it's going to have to be large because the cathedral is gargantuan. While all this competition stuff was happening, the Opera also needed to address a very important fact, and that was where were they going to get all the lumber that would be necessary to build a wooden framework as large essentially as the dome. They decided to actually purchase a forest, okay, just east of the city in an area called the Consuma, so that they could cut out the middleman, right? If you're going to need all that lumber, at least you have your own natural supply. In fact, a couple of years later, the Works Committee announced that there wasn't enough lumber in all of Italy to provide the necessary lumber to build the framework there. Okay? In fact, one of the men who participated in the competition proposed that instead of using wood to hold up the masonry, that they would use dirt, earth. Okay, a giant pile of dirt inside the crossing of the church, and they would build on top of this giant pile of dirt, and when completed, they would announce to the whole city that they had secretly hidden gold coins in the giant pile of dirt. Okay? And they would announce to the city that everyone was free to come in and take home as much dirt as they wanted, because the more dirt you took home, the better your chances at finding the gold coins. That it was more cost effective to build it that way than it was to buy all the lumber for the center. The other reason the baptistry is so important is because of its age. Consecrated in the year 1059 AD, which makes the baptistry about how old? Left brain, right brain, guys, I keep you jumping back and forth. About 1,000 years old. Okay, take it from me, we as Americans have no clue what it means when something is 1,000 years old, because there's nothing in US history that you can balance that against, okay? So this past 4th of July, we were celebrating a whopping 242 years of American history, okay, which remember by European standards was earlier this morning.